The morning sun painted golden stripes across the marble floor of St. Peter's Basilica. It was Easter Sunday, 1887, and Rome buzzed with excitement. People from all over the world had come to see Pope Leo XIV celebrate this holy day. The massive church stood like a giant guardian over Vatican City, its dome reaching toward heaven like a prayer made of stone. Inside the basilica, hundreds of workers moved like busy ants. They polished every surface until it gleamed. They arranged flowers in tall vases and hung silk banners from the walls. The smell of fresh lilies mixed with the old scent of incense that had lived in these walls for centuries. Everything had to be perfect for tonight's special concert. Pope Leo XIV walked slowly through the great hall, his white robes flowing behind him like clouds. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself with quiet strength. His eyes, bright behind wire glasses, took in every detail. The Pope loved music more than almost anything else. He believed that beautiful music could lift people's hearts straight to God. "Your Holiness," called Cardinal Rossini, hurrying to catch up with the Pope. "The choir is ready for their final practice. Would you like to hear them?" The Pope smiled. "Yes, my dear Cardinal. Music is the language of angels. Let us listen." They walked together toward the choir area. 50 men and boys stood in neat rows, their black robes making them look like a flock of ravens. But when they opened their mouths, the sound that came out was pure gold. Their voices rose and fell together, creating harmonies that seemed to dance in the air above them. The Pope closed his eyes and listened. The music wrapped around him like a warm embrace. This was why he had planned tonight's concert. He wanted everyone who came to feel what he felt now, that moment when earthly troubles melted away and only beauty remained. "Beautiful," he whispered, when the last note faded. "Simply beautiful." The choir master, Father Giuseppe, bowed deeply. He was an old man with gentle eyes who had trained church choirs for 40 years. "Thank you, Your Holiness. The boys have practiced every day for 2 months. They want to sing perfectly for you." "And they shall," said the Pope. "Tell me, has our special guest arrived yet?" Father Giuseppe's smile flickered for just a moment. "Not yet, Your Holiness. But his agent sent word that Maestro Benedetti will arrive this afternoon. He wants time to practice on the piano before tonight." The Pope nodded. He had heard wonderful things about Giovanni Benedetti. The young pianist was said to be one of the most talented musicians in all of Italy. His concerts in Milan and Venice had made audiences weep with joy. The Pope had personally requested that Benedetti perform tonight, hoping his gift would add something special to their Easter celebration. As the morning turned to afternoon, more people began arriving at the Vatican. Cardinals in their red robes walked arm in arm with bishops in purple. Wealthy families from Rome's finest neighborhoods came in elegant carriages. Foreign diplomats wore their finest uniforms, covered with medals and ribbons. Even some royal visitors had traveled from distant countries just for this night. The Pope watched from his window as the crowds gathered in St. Peter's Square below. Children ran between their parents' legs while vendors sold flowers and small religious tokens. The excitement in the air was almost electric. Everyone knew this would be a night to remember. In the basilica, servants lit hundreds of candles. The flames danced and flickered, casting moving shadows on the painted ceiling high above. The great dome seemed to glow with its own inner light. Ancient statues of saints looked down with marble eyes, as if they too were waiting for the evening to begin. The Pope's personal secretary, Monsignor Alberti, approached with a worried expression. "Your Holiness, there is a small problem with the seating arrangement. The Russian ambassador wants to sit closer to the front, but the French delegation says they were promised those seats." The Pope chuckled softly. "My dear Alberti, tonight, we are all equal in the eyes of God. Tell them both that the best seat in any church is the one where your heart is most open to receive blessing." As evening approached, the Pope retired to his private chambers to prepare. He knelt in prayer before a simple wooden crucifix, asking God to bless the evening ahead. He prayed that the music would touch people's hearts and bring them closer to heaven. He had no idea that in just a few hours his own faith would be tested in a way he never expected. The bells of St. Peter's began to ring, calling everyone to come inside. The sound echoed across Rome, a musical invitation that reached every corner of the ancient city. People streamed through the massive doors of the basilica, their voices creating a low murmur of excitement and anticipation. Inside, ushers in white gloves guided people to their seats. The church filled slowly, like a giant container being poured, full of humanity. Rich and poor sat side by side, all united by their desire to witness something beautiful. The Pope had insisted that half the seats be given free to ordinary Roman families, not just the wealthy and powerful. Young Marco, a baker's son from the poorest part of Rome, sat next to the Countess de' Medici, who wore diamonds that caught the candlelight like tiny stars. Neither seemed to mind. Tonight, their differences didn't matter. They were all here for the same reason, to celebrate Easter with music that would lift their spirits. The choir took their places looking nervous but excited. Father Giuseppe checked his pocket watch and nodded to his assistant. It was almost time to begin. The great organ in the back of the church played a few test notes, its deep voice rumbling through the stone walls like distant thunder. Pope Leo XIV appeared at the side entrance, and everyone rose to their feet. He walked slowly to his special chair, blessing people as he passed. Children reached out to touch his robes. Old women wept with joy just to see him. He was more than just a man to these people. He was their connection to something greater than themselves. As the Pope took his seat, a hush fell over the crowd. Nearly 2,000 people held their breath, waiting for the evening to begin. The candlelight flickered on their faces, creating a sea of golden light that stretched from the altar to the back doors. The air was thick with anticipation and the sweet smell of flowers. Father Giuseppe raised his hands, ready to signal the choir to begin. The Pope settled back in his chair, his eyes bright with expectation. He had planned this evening for months, choosing every song and every detail. With care, he wanted it to be perfect, a gift of beauty to celebrate the most important day in the Christian calendar. None of them knew that before this night was over, they would witness something that would be talked about for generations to come. The stage was set, the players were ready, and the story was about to unfold in ways that no one could have imagined. The sound of wheels on cobblestones echoed through the Vatican courtyard as a black carriage pulled by 2 white horses came to a stop. The driver jumped down and opened the door with a flourish. Out stepped a young man who looked like he owned the world. Giovanni Benedetti was 28 years old, tall and lean with dark hair that he wore longer than most men of his time. His clothes were expensive, a perfectly tailored black suit with a silk vest and a gold watch chain that caught the afternoon light. He carried himself like royalty, his chin up and his eyes scanning everything around him as if judging whether it was good enough for his presence. Behind him came his assistant, a nervous little man named Paolo who struggled with 2 large leather cases. These contained Benedetti's sheet music, his lucky gloves, and various other items the maestro claimed he needed for every performance. Paolo had worked for many famous musicians, but none had been as demanding as Giovanni Benedetti. "So, this is the famous Vatican," Benedetti said, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he was not impressed. "I expected something more grand." A Vatican official, Monsignor Alberti, hurried forward to greet them. He had been waiting for over an hour, checking his pocket watch every few minutes. The concert was set to begin in just 4 hours, and there was still much to prepare. "Maestro Benedetti, welcome to Vatican City," Alberti said with a respectful bow. "His Holiness Pope Leo XIV is very much looking forward to your performance tonight. The entire city is buzzing with excitement." Benedetti barely glanced at the Monsignor. Instead, he was staring up at the dome of St. Peter's Basilica with a critical eye. The acoustics might be challenging. These old buildings were not designed with proper musical performance in mind. Alberti blinked in surprise. St. Peter's was considered one of the most acoustically perfect buildings in all of Europe. Composers and musicians had praised its sound for centuries, but he simply smiled and said, "Perhaps you would like to test the piano before tonight? We have prepared everything exactly as your agent requested." "Of course I need to test it," Benedetti snapped. "Do you think I would perform on an instrument I haven't personally approved?" I am not some street musician who can play on any old piano. They walked through the massive doors of the basilica, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. Even Benedetti seemed momentarily impressed by the sheer size and beauty of the interior. Marble columns reached toward a ceiling painted with scenes from the Bible. Golden light streamed through stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns on the floor. But the maestro's moment of wonder didn't last long. "Where is the piano?" he demanded. Alberti led him to the front of the church where a magnificent grand piano sat near the altar. It was a Steinway, shipped specially from Germany for this occasion. The Vatican's music budget for the entire year had been spent just to rent this one instrument. Benedetti circled the piano like a hunter examining his prey. He ran his fingers along the polished wood, checking for scratches or imperfections. He lifted the lid and peered inside at the strings and hammers. Finally, he sat down on the bench and played a few scales. The sound that filled the basilica was breathtaking. Each note rang clear and true, bouncing off the marble walls and soaring up to the painted ceiling. Even the workers who were still arranging flowers stopped what they were doing to listen. But instead of being pleased, Benedetti frowned. The action is too heavy. The pedals are positioned wrong. And listen to that resonance in the upper register. Completely unacceptable. Alberti felt his heart sink. "But Maestro, this is one of the finest pianos in all of Europe. We specifically requested—" "I don't care what you requested," Benedetti interrupted. "I care about what I need to create art. This instrument is adequate at best. I suppose I'll have to make do, but don't expect miracles." At that moment, Father Giuseppe approached with several members of the choir. They had come early to do one final practice before the evening's performance. The old choirmaster had heard about the famous pianist and was excited to meet him. "Maestro Benedetti," Father Giuseppe said warmly, "what an honor to have you perform in our humble church. I am Father Giuseppe, the choirmaster. These are some of my singers. We are all great admirers of your work." The choir members, young and old, looked at Benedetti with shining eyes. They had heard recordings of his playing and had dreamed of hearing him perform in person. Several of the younger boys seemed almost ready to ask for his autograph. Benedetti looked at them with barely concealed irritation. "Yes, well, I hope you can keep up. I notice the program has me performing after your choir pieces. I trust you. Won't take too long with your performances. My audience doesn't come to hear amateur singing." The choir members exchanged shocked glances. Father Giuseppe's face reddened, but he kept his voice steady. "Of course, Maestro. We have prepared traditional Easter hymns that His Holiness specifically requested. Our program should last exactly 30 minutes. 30 minutes? Benedetti laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You could probably cover everything worth hearing in half that time, but I suppose people expect a certain amount of local flavor." One of the younger choir members, a boy named Antonio, who couldn't have been more than 16, spoke up bravely. "Sir, we've been practicing every day for 2 months. We know every note by heart." Benedetti turned his cold gaze on the boy. "Knowing the notes and making music are two very different things, child. You'll understand when you're older, if you ever develop any real talent." The basilica fell silent. Even the workers stopped their hammering and arranging. Father Giuseppe put a protective hand on Antonio's shoulder, his face now dark with anger. "Maestro," Father Giuseppe said quietly, "these young men have dedicated their lives to serving God through music. They deserve respect." Benedetti waved his hand dismissively. "I respect talent, Father. Nothing else matters in music. Dedication without ability is just noise." He turned back to the piano and began playing scales again, clearly indicating that the conversation was over. The sound was beautiful, but somehow it felt cold in the vast, sacred space. It was technically perfect, but seemed to lack something essential, something that the simple choir possessed in abundance. Father Giuseppe gathered his choir and led them to the other side of the basilica to practice. As they walked away, Benedetti called after them, "Try to stay in tempo tonight. Nothing ruins a professional performance like amateur mistakes." The choir members were hurt and angry, but Father Giuseppe whispered to them, "Remember, we sing For God, not for the approval of men. Let our voices carry love, not pride. Meanwhile, Benedetti continued his practice, playing increasingly complex pieces with flawless technique. His fingers danced across the keys like lightning, creating cascades of notes that echoed through the ancient halls. But several Vatican officials who listened found themselves feeling oddly empty, as if they were hearing the sounds of music without its soul. Alberti watched nervously from nearby. He had heard rumors about Benedetti's difficult personality, but had hoped they were exaggerated. Now he was beginning to worry about what the evening might bring. The maestro clearly had no respect for the sacred nature of the venue or the religious significance of the occasion. As the afternoon wore on, Benedetti made increasingly unreasonable demands. He wanted different lighting, a softer bench cushion, and even suggested that some of the altar decorations be moved because they distracted from his performance area. Each request was met with polite compliance, but the Vatican staff were beginning to exchange worried looks. Finally, as the sun began to set outside the great windows, Benedetti announced he was satisfied with his preparations. "I suppose this will have to do," he said with a sigh. At least the audience should appreciate hearing real music for once. He swept out of the basilica to prepare for the evening, leaving behind a group of confused and concerned Vatican officials. None of them had ever encountered such arrogance in their sacred halls. They had expected a great artist, but instead had met a man who seemed to care more about his own reputation than about the holy purpose of their gathering. As the first guests began arriving for the concert, word of Benedetti's behavior had already begun to spread among the Vatican staff. But there was nothing to be done now. The evening would proceed as planned. They could only hope that once the music began, the maestro's talent would overshadow his pride. Little did they know that Giovanni Benedetti's arrogance was about to create a situation that would test not only his own character, but also reveal the true nature of the man who sat on the throne of St. Peter. The great bells of St. Peter's rang out across Rome as the sun disappeared behind the Vatican walls. Inside the basilica, nearly 2,000 people filled every seat, their excited whispers creating a soft buzz that echoed through the sacred space. Candles flickered like tiny stars against the marble walls, and the smell of fresh flowers mixed with centuries-old incense. Pope Leo XIV entered through the side door, his white robes flowing behind him like water. Every person in the basilica rose to their feet as one, their voices joining in respectful applause. Children pressed forward to touch his robes as he passed. Old women wept with joy just to see him. The Pope moved slowly, blessing people with gentle gestures, his kind eyes taking in every face. He took his place in the ornate papal chair positioned to give him a perfect view of both the altar and the piano. The chair itself was a work of art, carved from dark wood and covered in deep red velvet. Golden threads formed religious symbols across the fabric, catching the candlelight and making them seem to glow. The Pope looked out over the sea of faces. Before him, he saw rich merchants sitting next to poor farmers. Foreign diplomats in their fancy uniforms shared pews with Roman fishermen still smelling of the sea. Cardinals in their red robes sat alongside ordinary mothers, holding sleeping babies. This was exactly what he had hoped for. All of God's children gathered together as one family. Cardinal Rossini stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice, trained by years of preaching, carried easily to the back of the great church. "My brothers and sisters, we gather tonight to celebrate our Lord's resurrection through the gift of music. His Holiness Pope Leo XIV welcomes you all to this sacred place on this most holy of nights." The crowd murmured their appreciation, and many made the sign of the cross. The Pope smiled and raised his hand in blessing. For a moment, the entire basilica felt united in peace and joy. Father Giuseppe appeared at the front of the church, leading his choir of 50 voices. The men and boys were dressed in their finest black robes, their faces serious but excited. They had practiced for months for this moment, and despite the afternoon's unpleasant encounter with Benedetti, they were ready to sing their hearts out. The old choir master raised his hands and the church fell into complete silence. Even the babies seemed to sense the importance of the moment and stopped their crying. 2,000 people held their breath, waiting. Then the music began. It started softly, just a few voices humming a melody as old as the church itself. Gradually, more voices joined in, building layer upon layer of harmony. The sound grew and swelled until it seemed to fill every corner of the vast space. The words were in Latin, but their meaning was clear to every heart: praise, joy, thanksgiving, and hope. The music seemed to lift the very air in the basilica. Some people closed their eyes and swayed gently with the rhythm. Others wept quietly as the beautiful sounds washed over them. The Pope himself leaned forward in his chair, completely absorbed in the performance. Young Antonio, the boy Benedetti had insulted that afternoon, stepped forward for a solo passage. His clear, sweet voice rose above the others like a bird taking flight. The notes seemed to dance among the painted figures on the ceiling high above. Even the marble saints appeared to be listening, their carved faces somehow more peaceful in the flickering candlelight. The choir moved through their program with perfect precision. They sang Gloria in Excelsis Deo, with voices that seemed touched by angels. Their Alleluia filled the dome and came back down like gentle rain. Each song was offered not as a performance but as a prayer made of music. The Pope watched with growing joy. This was what he had dreamed of. Music that didn't just entertain, but that lifted souls toward heaven. He could see the effect on the faces around him. Hardened soldiers had tears in their eyes. Wealthy women who rarely thought of anyone but themselves were reaching out to comfort strangers. Children sat perfectly still, their young hearts somehow understanding that they were experiencing something special. Between songs, Father Giuseppe would pause and look toward the Pope, who would nod encouragingly. The old choir master had worried all afternoon about Benedetti's harsh words to his singers, but now he could see that they had not let arrogance dim their spirits. They sang with even more passion than usual, as if trying to prove that dedication and love could create beauty, just as real as technical perfection. As the choir program continued, no one noticed a figure watching from the shadows near the piano. Giovanni Benedetti had arrived early and was observing the performance with a mixture of surprise and irritation. He had expected amateur singing that would make his own performance shine even brighter by comparison. Instead, he found himself listening to music that, while not technically complex, carried an emotional power he had rarely encountered. The maestro frowned as he watched the audience's reaction. People were completely absorbed in the simple church music. They swayed with the rhythms, sang along with familiar hymns, and seemed to forget everything else existed. This was not the kind of sophisticated appreciation he was used to receiving in concert halls. But what bothered him most was the expression on Pope Leo XIV's face. The Pope was listening with complete attention and obvious joy, as if this simple choir music was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. Benedetti had expected the Pope to be merely polite about the opening act, waiting for the real artistry to begin. Instead, he seemed genuinely moved by every note. The choir reached their final piece, a traditional Easter hymn that everyone in the audience knew by heart. Without any prompting, voices from all over the basilica began joining in. Rich and poor, young and old, Italian and foreign visitors, they all sang together in a dozen different languages, but somehow it all blended into one magnificent sound. The Pope himself began to sing, his voice soft but clear. Cardinals and bishops joined in, then the entire congregation. The sound that rose from 2,000 throats was unlike anything heard in those ancient halls in years. It was not technically perfect. Some voices cracked, others wandered off key, but it carried a power that no professional choir could match. As the last notes faded away, the silence that followed was profound. No one applauded at first. They simply sat in the afterglow of something beautiful, letting the music settle into their hearts. Finally, the Pope began to clap, and the rest of the audience joined in with enthusiasm that shook the very walls. Father Giuseppe bowed deeply toward the papal chair, his weathered face glowing with pride and joy. His choir members smiled and nodded to friends and family in the audience. They had done their best, and the response told them their best had been more than good enough. The Pope rose from his chair and walked toward the choir. This was not planned. Protocol said he should remain seated throughout the performance, but he felt moved to express his gratitude in person. The audience watched in fascination as their spiritual leader approached the simple church musicians. "Dear Father Giuseppe," the Pope said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent basilica, "you and your choir have given us a gift tonight. You have shown us that the most beautiful music comes not from the hands alone, but from hearts filled with love." The old choir master's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Your Holiness. We sing only to serve God and bring joy to His people." "And you have done both magnificently," the Pope replied. He then turned to young Antonio, the boy who had sung the solo. "Your voice carries the purity of angels, my son. Never let anyone tell you it is not beautiful." The boy beamed with happiness, remembering Benedetti's cruel words from the afternoon. The Pope's praise meant more to him than any amount of technical criticism ever could. As the Pope returned to his chair, he felt completely satisfied with the evening so far. The music had been everything he had hoped for, and more. Now came the second part of the program, the famous pianist who had traveled from far away to perform in their sacred halls. The Pope settled back in his chair with eager anticipation. He had heard wonderful things about Giovanni Benedetti's talent, and after the beautiful opening by his choir, he was ready for an evening of musical perfection. He had no way of knowing that the young maestro, still standing in the shadows, was planning something that would shock everyone present and test the very foundations of Christian grace. The choir members filed quietly back to their seats, their faces still glowing with the joy of their performance. Father Giuseppe remained standing at the front, ready to introduce the evening's special guest. The audience settled into their seats with satisfied sighs, their hearts still warm from the beautiful sacred music they had just experienced. Cardinal Rossini approached the center of the basilica, his red robes rustling softly against the marble floor. The candlelight caught the golden threads in his vestments as he prepared to speak. His voice, trained by decades of addressing large congregations, carried easily to every corner of the vast space. "My dear brothers and sisters," he began, "we have been blessed tonight by the voices of angels in our own choir. Now, His Holiness Pope Leo XIV has arranged for us to hear one of Europe's most celebrated musicians. Please welcome Maestro Giovanni Benedetti, who has traveled from Milan to honor us with his artistry." Polite applause rippled through the crowd as Giovanni Benedetti emerged from the shadows. He walked with confident strides toward the magnificent piano, his expensive clothes and perfectly groomed appearance making him look like nobility. Several people in the audience whispered to their neighbors about his reputation as a musical genius. The maestro reached the piano and paused dramatically, surveying the audience like a general reviewing his troops. His dark eyes swept across the sea of faces, taking in the cardinals in their red robes, the wealthy families in their finest clothes, and the common people who had been allowed to attend this special evening. He bowed toward Pope Leo XIV, but it was a shallow bow, more of a nod really, lacking the deep respect that others had shown. The Pope smiled warmly and nodded in return, clearly eager to hear what this famous musician would offer to their Easter celebration. Benedetti sat at the piano bench and adjusted it with theatrical precision. He flexed his fingers, cracked his knuckles, and arranged his sheet music with exaggerated care. The audience watched these preparations with growing anticipation. This was clearly a man who took his art very seriously. "Tonight," Benedetti announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent basilica, "I will perform for you the Ave Maria, as requested by His Holiness." The Pope leaned forward in his chair, his eyes bright with expectation. Ave Maria was one of his favorite pieces of music, a prayer to the Virgin Mary set to the most beautiful melody ever written. He had specifically requested this piece because he felt it perfectly captured the spirit of Easter and the hope of resurrection. The audience settled into reverent silence. Mothers pulled their children closer. Old men removed their caps and held them over their hearts. Foreign diplomats who didn't understand the Latin words still recognized the sacred nature of the moment. Everyone expected to be transported to heaven by this famous musician's interpretation of one of Christianity's most beloved songs. Benedetti placed his hands on the keys and began to play. But instead of the gentle, reverent opening of Ave Maria, what came from the piano was something completely different. The melody was wild and passionate, full of dramatic flourishes and complex runs that had nothing to do with sacred music. It was a piece from an Italian opera, flashy and emotional, designed to show off a performer's technical skill rather than inspire religious devotion. The audience stirred uncertainly in their seats. This didn't sound like Ave Maria at all. Perhaps the maestro was beginning with some kind of introduction. Surely he would move into the familiar sacred melody soon. But Benedetti continued with the operatic piece, his fingers dancing across the keys with incredible speed and precision. The music was undeniably beautiful from a technical standpoint. Every note was perfect, every passage flawlessly executed. But it felt completely wrong in the sacred setting of St. Peter's Basilica on Easter night. The Pope's smile slowly faded as he realized what was happening. This was not Ave Maria. This was not even sacred music. The young maestro had apparently decided to ignore the specifically requested program and perform whatever he pleased instead. Murmurs began to ripple through the congregation. People turned to their neighbors with confused expressions. Children asked their parents why the music sounded so different from what the choir had sung. The cardinals and bishops exchanged concerned glances, unsure of how to respond to this breach of protocol. But Giovanni Benedetti seemed oblivious to the growing confusion in his audience. If anything, he appeared to be enjoying himself more as he moved into even more elaborate passages. His head swayed with the music, his long hair flying as he threw himself into the performance with theatrical passion. The piece he was playing was from La Traviata, a tragic opera about a courtesan who dies of tuberculosis. While beautiful, in its proper setting, it was shockingly inappropriate for a religious service. The dramatic, emotional music seemed to mock the sacred atmosphere that had been so carefully created. As Benedetti continued, something even more disturbing became apparent. He was looking directly at Pope Leo XIV as he played, and there was something challenging in his expression. It was as if he was daring the Pope to stop him, testing to see what this religious leader would do when faced with such open disrespect. The maestro's fingers flew over the keys in increasingly complex passages, each one more showy than the last. He added his own embellishments to the original composition, turning it into a display of pure technical virtuosity. But there was something cold about it, something that seemed to care more about impressing people with his skill than about creating genuine beauty. Cardinal Rossini, who was still standing near the front of the church, looked helplessly toward the Pope. Protocol demanded that he allow the performance to continue, but this was clearly not what had been planned or promised. He could see the confusion and growing displeasure on the faces of the congregation. Some of the foreign visitors, who might not have known what piece was supposed to be performed, simply enjoyed the spectacular display of musical skill. But the Roman Catholics in the audience, especially the clergy, understood exactly what was happening. Their sacred celebration was being turned into a concert hall performance by a young man who apparently had no respect for the holy nature of the occasion. Father Giuseppe, still seated with his choir members, felt his face burning with anger and embarrassment. He had worried about Benedetti's attitude during their afternoon encounter, but he had never imagined the young man would so blatantly disrespect the Pope and the sacred service. Young Antonio, the boy who had sung the beautiful solo earlier, watched with wide eyes as this famous musician seemed to make a mockery of everything they had just celebrated. The contrast between the choir's humble, heartfelt offering and this flashy, self-centered display could not have been greater. The piece Benedetti was playing reached its climactic moment, with cascading runs that echoed dramatically off the marble walls and painted ceiling. The sound was magnificent in terms of pure musical technique, but it felt empty and hollow in the sacred space. It was like watching someone perform acrobatic tricks in a cathedral. Impressive, but somehow insulting to everything the building represented. As the music swirled and soared through the ancient halls, Pope Leo XIV sat perfectly still in his ornate chair. His face showed no anger, but the joy that had shone in his eyes during the choir performance was completely gone. He was witnessing something he had never encountered in all his years as the leader of the Catholic Church. Open, deliberate disrespect, performed right in front of him by someone he had personally invited and honored. The audience was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Some people began whispering more loudly to their neighbors. Others shifted restlessly in their seats. The beautiful, peaceful atmosphere that had been created by the choir's sacred music was being destroyed by this inappropriate performance. But Giovanni Benedetti played on, seemingly unaware or uncaring about the reaction he was causing. He had come here expecting to dazzle this religious audience with his superior artistry, to show them what real music sounded like, compared to their simple church singing. In his arrogance, he couldn't see that he was destroying something beautiful, rather than creating it. The operatic piece was building toward its grand finale, and Benedetti threw himself into it with even more theatrical passion. His whole body swayed with the music as he attacked the keys with fierce precision. The sound filled every corner of the vast basilica, but instead of lifting hearts toward heaven, it seemed to pull them down into the performer's own ego and pride. As the final notes crashed through the sacred space, Giovanni Benedetti struck a dramatic pose at the piano, his chest heaving as if he had just conquered a mountain. He looked up at his audience with a satisfied smile, clearly expecting the same kind of enthusiastic applause that usually greeted his concert performances. But what he saw instead was 2,000 faces staring back at him with expressions ranging from confusion to disappointment to outright disapproval. The silence that followed his performance was not the awed hush that follows great art, but the uncomfortable quiet that follows a serious mistake. The silence that followed Giovanni Benedetti's performance was deafening. It stretched across the vast basilica like a heavy blanket, broken only by the soft flickering of candle flames and the distant sound of Roman traffic beyond the thick walls. 2,000 people sat frozen in their seats, unsure of how to respond to what they had just witnessed. Giovanni Benedetti remained at the piano, his hands still positioned on the keys, his chest rising and falling from the exertion of his dramatic performance. For the first time since he had begun playing, he seemed to notice that something was wrong. The usual thunderous applause that greeted his concerts was nowhere to be found. The maestro's confident smile began to waver as he looked out over the sea of faces staring back at him. Instead of the admiration and awe he expected to see, he found expressions of confusion, disappointment, and in some cases barely contained anger. The wealthy patrons of the arts who usually showered him with praise after his performances were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding his gaze. Cardinal Rossini, still standing near the altar, cleared his throat softly and began what should have been enthusiastic applause. A few scattered claps echoed through the marble halls, but they sounded thin and forced in the vast space. Some people joined in out of politeness, but their applause was hesitant and brief, dying away quickly like rain on dry ground. The sound of this half-hearted response was more insulting than complete silence would have been. It told Benedetti, clearly, that his audience was not impressed but was merely being polite. For a man accustomed to standing ovations and cries of "Bravo!" this lukewarm reception felt like a slap in the face. But instead of feeling embarrassed by his obvious failure to please his audience, Giovanni Benedetti felt a surge of anger and defiance. These people clearly didn't appreciate real artistry when they heard it. They had been so moved by the simple amateur singing of the church choir that they couldn't recognize superior musical skill when it was presented to them. The maestro rose from his piano bench with deliberate slowness, his movements calculated for maximum dramatic effect. He adjusted his expensive jacket and smoothed back his dark hair, trying to maintain the appearance of confidence even as doubt began to creep into his mind. Instead of bowing humbly as custom demanded, especially in the presence of the Pope, Benedetti stood tall and surveyed his audience with an expression that bordered on contempt. His dark eyes swept across the congregation, taking in their disappointed faces and uncomfortable body language. Then, in a moment that would be remembered and talked about for decades to come, Giovanni Benedetti did something that shocked everyone present. He looked directly at Pope Leo XIV, sitting in his ornate chair at the front of the basilica, and smiled. But it was not a smile of respect or gratitude. It was a cold, arrogant smile that seemed to mock everything the evening was supposed to represent. The Pope, who had been sitting quietly throughout the inappropriate performance, met the young man's gaze steadily. His weathered face showed no anger, but the joy and anticipation that had been there earlier was completely gone. He looked like a grandfather who had just watched a beloved grandchild deliberately break something precious. Benedetti's smile widened as he saw that he had the Pope's full attention. In his twisted thinking, he believed he was showing these religious people what real artistic superiority looked like. He had come here expecting to dazzle them with his skills, and their lack of appreciation only proved to him that they were not sophisticated enough to understand true artistry. The maestro then did something even more shocking. While still maintaining eye contact with the Pope, he returned to the piano and began playing again. But this time, he chose an even more inappropriate piece. A wild, passionate section from Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata that he transformed into an exhibition of pure technical showing off. His fingers flew across the keys with incredible speed, creating cascades of notes that echoed off the ancient walls. He added his own embellishments to the classic piece, turning it into something flashy and circus-like. All the while, he kept glancing toward Pope Leo XIV, as if challenging the holy man to stop him. The audience watched in growing horror as this public humiliation of their beloved Pope continued. Many of the Roman Catholics in the congregation had never seen such blatant disrespect shown to any religious authority, let alone the head of their church. Some of the older women began making the sign of the cross and muttering prayers under their breath. Cardinal Rossini took a step forward, clearly considering whether to intervene and stop this disgraceful display. But protocol was complicated when it came to interrupting a papal guest, especially one who had been personally invited to perform. He looked toward the Pope for guidance, but Leo XIV remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the young pianist. Father Giuseppe, sitting with his choir members, felt his face burning with shame and anger. His simple singers had offered their music as a prayer, a gift of love to God and their fellow worshippers. This young man was using his superior technique to make a mockery of everything they had just celebrated. Several of his choir members were whispering angrily among themselves, their faces flushed with indignation. Young Antonio, the boy who had sung the beautiful solo, watched with wide eyes as his musical hero revealed himself to be something very different from what he had imagined. The child had dreamed of someday becoming a great musician like Benedetti, but now he was seeing that technical skill without humility and love was worse than useless. It was destructive. The foreign diplomats in the audience were perhaps the most uncomfortable of all. They had come expecting a dignified religious ceremony that would reflect well on the Vatican's cultural sophistication. Instead, they were witnessing what appeared to be a deliberate insult to their host. Some of them were already mentally composing the reports they would have to send back to their home countries about this bizarre incident. As Benedetti continued his ostentatious display, adding more and more elaborate flourishes to show off his technical mastery, the atmosphere in the basilica became increasingly tense. What had begun as a beautiful evening of sacred music was turning into something ugly and confrontational. The maestro reached the climax of his impromptu performance, his hands moving so fast they seemed to blur. The music was undeniably impressive from a technical standpoint. Probably few other pianists in Europe could have played with such precision and speed. But in the sacred setting, surrounded by centuries of Christian worship and devotion, it felt hollow and meaningless. Worse than that, it felt deliberately insulting. Everyone present could see that Benedetti was not just playing music. He was making a statement. He was showing these religious people that their simple faith and humble music meant nothing compared to his artistic genius. He was proving, at least in his own mind, that he was superior to everything they valued and believed in. The performance finally ended with a thunderous chord that echoed through the marble halls like a gunshot. Benedetti stood once again, breathing heavily from his exertions, and this time his smile was openly mocking. He had just humiliated the Pope in front of 2,000 witnesses, and he seemed proud of his accomplishment. The silence that followed was even more complete than before. Not a single person applauded. Not even Cardinal Rossini could bring himself to offer polite recognition for what they had just witnessed. The only sounds were the soft crackling of candle flames and the barely audible whispers of people who couldn't believe what they had just seen. Giovanni Benedetti stood alone at the front of the basilica, suddenly aware that his grand gesture had not achieved what he intended. Instead of proving his superiority, he had isolated himself completely. 2,000 people were staring at him with expressions ranging from pity to disgust, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly alone on a stage. But the most powerful presence in that moment was Pope Leo XIV, still sitting quietly in his ornate chair, still looking directly at the young man who had just publicly humiliated him in his own church on the holiest night of the Christian year. The Pope's face showed no anger, no desire for revenge, no wounded pride. Instead, there was something else there, something that would soon teach Giovanni Benedetti a lesson he would never forget. The great basilica held its breath. 2,000 people sat frozen in their seats, their eyes moving between the arrogant young pianist and their beloved Pope. The tension in the air was so thick it seemed to press down on everyone like a heavy blanket. Candle flames flickered in the stillness, casting dancing shadows on the marble walls that had witnessed centuries of both triumph and tragedy. Giovanni Benedetti stood beside the piano, his chest still rising and falling from his theatrical performance. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing what it felt like to face an audience that was completely unimpressed with his abilities. The silence that greeted his show of musical superiority was more devastating than any criticism he had ever received. Cardinal Rossini remained near the altar, his red robes seeming to glow in the candlelight. His weathered hands were clasped tightly in front of him, his knuckles white with tension. He had served the church for 40 years, but he had never witnessed such blatant disrespect shown to a pope. He waited for some sign from his holy leader about how to respond to this unprecedented situation. The choir members, still seated in their designated area, whispered among themselves in shocked tones. Father Giuseppe's face was red with embarrassment and anger. His simple singers had offered their music as a prayer, and this famous musician had turned their sacred celebration into a circus act. Several of the younger boys looked ready to shout their disapproval, but their training in respect and discipline held them back. Among the congregation, emotions ran high. The wealthy Roman families who had donated money to make this concert possible felt personally insulted. Foreign diplomats shifted uncomfortably in their seats, already imagining the awkward reports they would have to send to their governments about this diplomatic disaster. Common people who had been given free tickets to attend this special evening felt confused and hurt that their beautiful experience had been spoiled by one man's arrogance. But all eyes were on Pope Leo XIV. The Holy Father sat perfectly still in his ornate chair, his white robes seeming to glow in the candlelight like fresh snow. His hands rested calmly on the carved armrests, showing no signs of the anger or wounded pride that everyone expected to see. His face was peaceful, almost serene, as if he were contemplating something far more important than the insult that had just been delivered to him. For what seemed like an eternity, the Pope simply looked at Giovanni Benedetti with steady, thoughtful eyes. There was no hatred in his gaze, no desire for revenge, no wounded ego demanding satisfaction. Instead, there was something that the young pianist couldn't quite identify, something that made him feel suddenly uncomfortable despite his outward show of confidence. Then, slowly and deliberately, Pope Leo XIV began to rise from his chair. The movement sent a ripple of anticipation through the crowd. Everyone expected the Pope to call for guards, to demand that this disrespectful young man be removed from the sacred premises immediately. Some hoped he would deliver a stern lecture about proper behavior in the house of God. Others thought he might simply leave, showing his disapproval by refusing to remain in the presence of such disrespect. But as the Pope stood to his full height, there was nothing threatening or angry in his posture. He moved with the same gentle dignity he always showed, his movements calm and measured. He adjusted his white zucchetto slightly and smoothed his robes with unconscious grace. The basilica fell into absolute silence. Even the babies stopped crying, as if sensing that something momentous was about to happen. The only sounds were the soft whisper of the Pope's robes and the gentle shuffle of his simple leather shoes against the marble floor. Step by step, Pope Leo XIV began walking toward the piano where Giovanni Benedetti stood waiting. The journey seemed to take forever, each footfall echoing softly in the vast space. The Pope's face remained peaceful, showing no trace of the anger that everyone expected and that the young musician certainly deserved. Cardinal Rossini watched in amazement. In all his years of service, he had never seen the Pope leave his designated place during a formal ceremony. Protocol dictated that others should come to him, not the other way around. But Leo XIV was clearly following a higher protocol than mere church tradition. As the Pope drew closer, Giovanni Benedetti's confident smirk began to fade. He had expected anger, confrontation, possibly even a dramatic scene that would make him the center of attention once again. Instead, he was faced with something he didn't understand: quiet dignity in the face of deliberate insult. The young pianist found himself taking a small step backward as the Pope approached. There was something unsettling about the holy man's calm response to humiliation. Benedetti had prepared himself for anger, which he could have met with more arrogance. He was not prepared for this gentle, measured approach. Father Giuseppe leaned forward in his seat, straining to see what would happen when the Pope reached the piano. His choir members watched with wide eyes, some of them holding their breath. They had never seen their beloved Pope move with such purposeful calm, and they sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. The foreign diplomats in the audience sat transfixed. They had come expecting a routine religious ceremony, but now they were watching what might become a historic moment. Some of them were already making mental notes for the detailed reports they would need to write about this incident. Young Antonio, the boy who had sung the beautiful solo earlier, watched with the innocent clarity that only children possess. He could see something that many of the adults missed. The expression on the Pope's face was not one of anger or wounded pride, but of deep sadness mixed with something else. It looked almost like the expression his own grandfather wore when Antonio had done something wrong, but his grandfather still loved him anyway. As Pope Leo XIV continued his slow walk across the marble floor, Giovanni Benedetti felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead, despite the cool air in the basilica. This was not going as he had expected. He had wanted to shock these religious people, to prove his superiority over their simple faith and humble music. But something was happening that he hadn't planned for. The Pope was now close enough that Benedetti could see the details of his weathered face. The lines around his eyes spoke of years spent in prayer and service to others. His hands, now clasped gently in front of him, showed the wear of decades spent blessing, comforting, and serving. This was not just a religious official. This was a man who had dedicated his entire life to something far greater than himself. For the first time since arriving at the Vatican, Giovanni Benedetti felt a flicker of doubt about his behavior. The Pope's approach was stripping away all his defenses, all his justifications for what he had done. There was no anger to fight against, no outrage to dismiss with arrogance. There was only this quiet, dignified man walking toward him, with what looked remarkably like compassion. The audience watched in fascination as their spiritual leader covered the final few steps to reach the piano. No one could predict what would happen next. Would the Pope finally show his anger? Would he deliver a thundering condemnation of the young man's behavior? Would he call for guards to remove this disrespectful musician from the sacred premises? Instead, as Pope Leo XIV reached the piano where Giovanni Benedetti stood waiting, he did something that no one in that vast basilica expected, something that would be talked about and remembered for generations to come, something that would change not only the life of one arrogant young musician, but the lives of everyone who witnessed it. The Pope stopped directly in front of Giovanni Benedetti, close enough to touch him, and looked into his eyes with an expression of such profound kindness and understanding that it took the young man's breath away. Pope Leo XIV stood face to face with Giovanni Benedetti, so close that the young man could see the kindness in the Pope's weathered eyes and smell the faint scent of the holy oils used in blessing ceremonies. The entire basilica held its breath. 2,000 people waiting to see what their spiritual leader would do in response to such public humiliation. The silence stretched between the two men like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Giovanni Benedetti's confident smirk had completely disappeared, replaced by confusion and something he rarely felt: uncertainty. He had expected anger, confrontation, perhaps even physical removal from the premises. Instead, he found himself looking into eyes that held no hatred, no desire for revenge, no wounded pride demanding satisfaction. The Pope's face was calm and peaceful, showing the same gentle expression he wore when blessing children or comforting the sick. His white hair seemed to glow in the candlelight, and his simple white robes made him appear almost otherworldly in their purity. But it was his eyes that held Benedetti captive, eyes that seemed to see right through his arrogance to something deeper underneath. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The Pope simply studied the young pianist's face with the patient attention of someone who had spent decades learning to see the good in all people, even when it was hidden beneath layers of pride and selfishness. Benedetti found himself unable to maintain his usual swagger under that steady, compassionate gaze. Then, in a gesture that shocked everyone present, Pope Leo XIV slowly raised his hands and placed them gently on Giovanni Benedetti's shoulders. The touch was soft, almost fatherly, like a grandfather reaching out to comfort a troubled grandchild. The warmth of those weathered hands seemed to burn through the expensive fabric of Benedetti's jacket and straight into his heart. A collective gasp rose from the audience. In all their years of attending religious services, no one had ever seen anything like this. The Pope, the most powerful religious leader in the world, was showing tenderness to a man who had just publicly insulted him in his own church on the holiest night of the Christian year. Cardinal Rossini's mouth fell open in amazement. Father, Giuseppe and his choir members leaned forward in their seats, straining to hear what their beloved Pope would say. The foreign diplomats watched in fascination, knowing they were witnessing something that would be remembered in the history books. Even the children in the audience seemed to understand that something extraordinary was happening. When Pope Leo XIV finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear, carrying easily through the vast space of the silent basilica. Every word fell into the stillness like a stone dropped into perfectly calm water, creating ripples that spread to every corner of the ancient building. "My dear Giovanni," the Pope said, using the young man's first name with the familiar warmth usually reserved for family members. "Your talent is truly magnificent. God has blessed you with fingers that can create beauty and a mind that understands the mysteries of music in ways that few people ever will." Benedetti's eyes widened in surprise. He had expected condemnation, anger, perhaps a lecture about respect and proper behavior. Instead, the Pope was praising his abilities, acknowledging his talent with genuine appreciation. For a moment, the young man felt a surge of his old pride, thinking that perhaps this religious leader understood his superiority after all. But the Pope wasn't finished speaking. "Your gift is so great," Leo XIV continued, his hand still resting gently on Benedetti's shoulders, "that it carries with it a great responsibility. God does not give such talents lightly. They are meant to be used in service to others, to lift human hearts closer to heaven, to remind us all of the beauty that exists in this world despite its troubles and sorrows." The Pope paused, and in that pause, Giovanni Benedetti felt something shift inside his chest. The words were spoken with such genuine kindness, such obvious concern for his well-being rather than condemnation of his behavior, that they penetrated defenses he had spent years building around his heart. "Tonight," the Pope continued, his voice growing even softer and more gentle, "you have shown us the power of your talent. But talent without love is like a beautiful flower without fragrance, impressive to look at, but missing the very thing that makes it truly beautiful." The young pianist felt his throat tightening. No one had ever spoken to him like this before. His music teachers had praised his technique. His audiences had applauded his performances. His critics had written glowing reviews of his abilities. But no one had ever looked at him the way this simple, humble man was looking at him now, with complete understanding and unconditional love. I wonder, Pope Leo XIV said, his eyes never leaving Benedetti's face, if you might consider sharing with us the Ave Maria you originally planned to perform? Not because you must, but because I believe your heart has something beautiful to offer that your hands alone cannot express. The request was made so gently, with such obvious faith in the young man's better nature, that it hit Giovanni Benedetti like a physical blow. The Pope was not demanding anything, not threatening consequences, not even showing anger at the public humiliation he had just endured. Instead, he was offering the pianist a chance to redeem himself, to transform this moment of shame into something beautiful. Tears began to form in Benedetti's eyes, though he tried desperately to hold them back. All his life he had been praised for his technique, his speed, his ability to dazzle audiences with complex passages and theatrical presentations. But no one had ever cared about what was in his heart. No one had ever suggested that his music could be a gift of love rather than just a display of superiority. The Pope's hands were still resting on his shoulders, and Benedetti could feel the warmth and strength in those weathered fingers. They were hands that had blessed thousands of people, hands that had comforted the dying and lifted up the fallen, hands that had never been used to hurt anyone or to seek revenge for injuries received. Looking into the Pope's kind eyes, Benedetti suddenly saw himself as he really was, not the great artist he had always believed himself to be, but a young man so hungry for admiration and approval that he had forgotten the true purpose of his gift. He had turned his music into a weapon to prove his superiority over others, when it was meant to be a bridge that connected hearts and lifted spirits. "Your Holiness," Benedetti whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. I don't know if I can." The Pope smiled then, a smile so full of warmth and understanding that it seemed to light up the entire basilica. "My dear son," he said softly, "you can do anything when you play from your heart instead of from your pride. Trust in the gift God gave you, but more importantly, trust in the love God has for all his children, including you." The words hit Giovanni Benedetti like lightning. For the first time in his adult life, he realized that he had been playing music not to create beauty or inspire others, but to feed his own ego and prove his superiority. He had taken the gift God had given him and used it to build walls between himself and other people instead of bridges that connected them. Standing there in front of 2,000 witnesses, with the Pope's hands still resting gently on his shoulders, Giovanni Benedetti felt the walls around his heart begin to crumble. All the arrogance, all the pride, all the need to prove himself better than everyone else. It all suddenly seemed empty and foolish compared to the simple love he saw in this holy man's eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. "I'm so very sorry, Your Holiness." Pope Leo XIV's smile grew even warmer. "We are all forgiven, my son," he said quietly. "That is the gift of this holy season. Now, will you share with us the music of your heart?" Giovanni Benedetti stood trembling before the Pope, tears streaming down his face as the weight of his arrogance and selfishness crashed down upon him. In all his 28 years, no one had ever shown him such kindness in response to cruelty, such understanding in response to insult, such love in response to hatred. The Pope's gentle words and compassionate touch had shattered the walls of pride he had built around his heart. For a long moment, the young pianist couldn't speak. The basilica remained perfectly silent. 2,000 people watching this extraordinary scene unfold. They had come expecting an evening of beautiful music, but instead they were witnessing something far more profound: the transformation of a human soul. Pope Leo XIV kept his hands resting gently on Benedetti's shoulders, providing silent strength and comfort as the young man struggled with emotions he had never allowed himself to feel before. The Pope's weathered face showed infinite patience, as if he had all the time in the world to wait for this broken young man to find his way back to the light. Finally, Giovanni Benedetti nodded slowly, wiping the tears from his cheeks with the back of his hand. "Yes, Your Holiness," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the vast space. I would like to try." The Pope's smile was radiant, He squeezed Benedetti's shoulders one final time, then stepped back to give the young man room to return to the piano. "Play from your heart, my son," he said softly. "Trust in love and let God's gift flow through you." Giovanni Benedetti walked slowly back to the piano bench, his legs still shaking from the emotional earthquake that had just shaken his world. He sat down and placed his hands on the keys. But for the first time in his professional career, he wasn't thinking about technique or showing off his abilities. Instead, he was thinking about the Pope's words, about love, about the true purpose of the gift he had been given. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to quiet the storm of emotions in his chest. When he opened them again, he looked out over the audience with completely different eyes. Instead of seeing people to impress or judges to dazzle, he saw human beings who had come seeking beauty and inspiration. He saw mothers holding their children, elderly couples who had shared decades of love together, young people searching for meaning in their lives. For the first time, Giovanni Benedetti understood that music was not about the musician. It was about the listeners. It was not about proving superiority. It was about creating connection. It was not about taking something from the audience. It was about giving something to them. He placed his fingers gently on the keys and began to play Ave Maria. But this time, everything was different. Instead of the cold, technical perfection he usually displayed, his playing was filled with warmth and tenderness. Instead of complex flourishes designed to show off his skill, he played simply and purely, letting the beautiful melody speak for itself. Instead of performing for his own glory, he was offering a prayer made of music. The first notes that rose from the piano were soft and reverent, floating through the candlelit air like whispered prayers. The familiar melody, beloved by Christians around the world, seemed to wrap itself around every heart in the basilica. But there was something different about this performance, something that touched the soul rather than just impressing the mind. As Benedetti continued to play, tears began streaming down his face again. But these were not tears of shame or regret. They were tears of joy and release. For the first time in his life, he was playing music not to prove anything, but simply to create beauty. Not to elevate himself, but to lift others. Not to demonstrate his superiority, but to express his humanity. The melody flowed from his fingers like water from a spring, pure and clear and life-giving. Every note was perfect not because of technical precision, but because it came from a heart that had finally learned to love. The music seemed to fill not just the air but the very stones of the ancient building, as if the basilica itself was singing along. In the audience, the transformation was immediate and profound. People who had been uncomfortable and offended by Benedetti's earlier performance now sat transfixed by this completely different kind of music making. The wealthy patrons who had been embarrassed by his behavior now found themselves moved to tears by his humility. The foreign diplomats who had been preparing critical reports now listened in wonder to something they had never experienced before. Father Giuseppe and his choir members watched in amazement as this arrogant young man revealed what he was truly capable of when pride was replaced by love. Several of the choir boys were openly weeping, recognizing the same pure devotion in Benedetti's playing that they tried to bring to their own singing. Young Antonio, the boy who had sung the solo earlier, listened with his whole being to this transformed performance. He understood, with the clarity that only children possess, that he was witnessing a miracle, not the kind that changes physical laws, but the kind that changes human hearts. Cardinal Rossini stood with his hands clasped, in prayer, his own eyes filled with tears as he watched this demonstration of divine grace in action. In 40 years of church service, he had never seen anything more beautiful than this moment when mercy had conquered pride and love had triumphed over arrogance. But it was Pope Leo XIV's reaction that was most remarkable of all. The Holy Father had returned to his chair, but he was leaning forward, completely absorbed in the music that was now flowing from the piano. His face showed the same joy he had displayed during the choir's performance, but magnified by the knowledge of what this music represented: not just beautiful sound, but a soul redeemed. As the Ave Maria progressed through its beloved verses, Giovanni Benedetti felt something he had never experienced before. The music was flowing through him rather than from him, as if he had become a channel for something greater than himself. He wasn't fighting the piano or commanding it. He was dancing with it, partnering with it to create something beautiful together. The audience was completely silent except for the soft sound of weeping from many corners of the basilica. This was not the uncomfortable silence that had greeted his earlier performance, but the hushed reverence that comes when people recognize they are in the presence of something sacred. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Benedetti's playing became even more tender and expressive. He no longer cared about impressing anyone or proving anything. He simply wanted to offer this music as a gift to the Pope who had shown him such mercy, to the audience he had insulted with his arrogance, to God who had given him this ability in the first place. The final notes of Ave Maria faded away into the vast space of the basilica, leaving behind a silence that was completely different from what had come before. This was the silence of awe, of gratitude, of hearts that had been touched by genuine beauty and transformed by witnessing genuine redemption. For several long moments, no one moved. The experience had been too profound for immediate applause. Instead, 2,000 people sat in the afterglow of something miraculous, letting the music settle into their souls like seeds planted in fertile ground. Then, slowly, Pope Leo XIV began to stand. As he rose to his feet, the entire basilica followed his example, 2,000 people rising as one in a spontaneous standing ovation that had nothing to do with musical technique and everything to do with witnessing the power of grace to transform a human heart. The applause that followed was unlike anything Giovanni Benedetti had ever received in all his years of performing. It was not the excited cheering that greeted his usual concerts, but something deeper and more meaningful. The sound of 2,000 people expressing their gratitude for being allowed to witness a miracle of human redemption. Through his tears, Benedetti looked toward Pope Leo XIV and saw the holy man applauding not just his music, but his transformation. The Pope's face was radiant with joy, as if he had just watched a beloved son return home after a long and difficult journey. As the applause finally died away, Giovanni Benedetti stood and walked slowly toward the Pope's chair. When he reached the Holy Father, he knelt down on the marble floor and bowed his head in genuine humility. "Thank you, Your Holiness," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for showing me what my music could really be." Pope Leo XIV placed his hand gently on the young man's bowed head in blessing. "Thank you, my dear Giovanni," he replied softly, "for showing us all what happens when pride gives way to love." And in that moment, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Not just a beautiful musical performance, but a demonstration of how divine grace could transform even the most hardened heart and turn arrogance into humility, pride into love, and performance into prayer.